a member of the organizing committee, it is my privilege to moderate this third keynote speech of the APSafe conference, presented by Professor Poul Thompson. With so many positions, titles, book titles, and all to do the introduction by memory. Anyway, I'm 1 year older than Poul. Just don't be deceived by his several years. So, Professor Thompson is the W.K. Kellogg Professor of Agriculture, Food, and Community Ethics at Michigan State University, USA. Before this position, he was a professor of philosophy and agricultural economics at Texas A&M University, and later was a distinguished professor of philosophy at Purdue University. Poul is a celebrated philosopher in food and agricultural ethics, especially on technological and environmental aspects, such as the application of GMOs of agricultural crops and food animals. His achievements make him members of several advisory committees on agricultural biotechnology in the USA, in Netherlands, and in Canada. As a prolific writer, he has also written more than 10 books, starting from The Ethics of Aid and Trade, published in 1992, followed by The Spirit of Soil and The Ethics, Public Policy, and Agriculture. Both were published 2 years later. He also wrote books on food biotechnology and food nanotechnology, but his most recent book should be From Field to Fork, Food Ethics for Everyone, published in 2015. But I must warn you, do not be confused by the wording everyone, because I believe everyone here means every well-educated person. Am I right? Okay. So, although this lecture is a philosophical inquiry, but I believe Poul will speak in plain English for everyone. And I do believe that all our attendees are well educated. So, here is Professor Thompson.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be back in Taiwan. This is my 4th trip, and I've really enjoyed all my trips. And I think this has been a marvelous event. And I really want to congratulate the university and all of your collaborators for a really marvelous conference. So in this talk that I'm going to give today, I'm really looking pretty far forward. I'm really trying to stand at the end of a career and look forward and think about where food ethics may be going in the future. And in order to do that, I'm going to talk about 4 archetypes or visions for future food systems. And I'm going to talk about their shape, but I'm also going to talk about how they overlap with one another and also how they create tensions with one another. And then I'll conclude with just a few comments on how these archetypes might be shaping food and agricultural ethics in the future. So, you know, as I said, I have been on the path of food ethics for almost 40 years, and the talk that I'm giving today is from the perspective of someone who's standing on the end of that path and looking out on the horizon as to where I think things are going. But I realize that many of you in the audience, the whole idea of food ethics is somewhat new to you. And so I want to actually start by just noticing that many of us have entered this path at different points along the way. And let me just note just a few of the ways in which people enter into this path of food ethics. As I said for myself, I think I'm a very unusual case. My training was in philosophy of technology and philosophy of science, and I was recruited to work on agriculture by the leaders in agriculture at Texas A&M University and some other very influential figures. All of them have passed away now, who felt that the agricultural sciences and the agricultural universities had really missed the opportunity to incorporate philosophy into their programming. They had groups of sociologists and groups of anthropologists and groups of economists focused on the social dimension, but they had never really reached out to the discipline of philosophy. They had communication specialists and educational specialists, but philosophy had never been incorporated into the agricultural sciences. And so that is essentially how I got started doing this. Essentially, it was my job. And I started doing this in 1980, teaching courses in agricultural ethics, and have gradually become very interested in all the problems that make up the field of agricultural ethics. But this is not, I realize, the way that many people will have entered the field. Many people entered the field because agriculture has always been, or at least for the last 200 years, has been associated with some significant problems in social justice. Farmers being displaced from farmland, farm workers being poorly paid, being exploited, being ill-treated, being enslaved in many parts of the world. And so for many people, the field of agricultural and food ethics is really focused on some of these issues of social justice. We've now reached a position in the United States where we have only 1% of our population in agriculture, whereas at the beginning of the 20th century we would have still had approximately 80%, between 70 and 80% of our population. So this massive transformation has been accompanied by major cultural shifts and major kinds of social shifts as well. Other people come into food ethics because they have seen some of the impacts that industrial farming technologies have had on the environment or on animals. And here I've put pictures of two of the influential books from the 1960s. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is a critique of agricultural pesticides, and Ruth Harrison's Animal Machines, which was really one of the first critiques of some of the intensive animal production systems. And so there's been this recognition that thinking about these environmental and animal impacts of industrial production are ethical issues. And so many people have come on to the path of food ethics, thinking about these issues and trying to understand how we should think about our moral obligations to nature, to ecology, or to non-human animals. And then I think most recently we've seen the rise of an ethical consumption movement. In the United States, this was really influenced by Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, in 2005, I think, or I may be getting that year wrong. But he wrote this book sort of thinking about how can I be an ethical eater? How can I eat in an ethical fashion? And so this has spurred the creation of a consumer movement where people focus on fair trade. They buy products that are labeled as fair trade. They buy products that are labeled as animal welfare friendly. They buy products that are labeled as green. And they think of ethics as a kind of consumption practice. So this has, I think, really led to a real upsurge of interest in food ethics internationally. So with these four movements, I think one of the questions that I want to ask today is, are we all coming together, or are we moving in opposite directions? Is there any real sense in which these different paths that have led to the creation of food ethics are converging on a single crossroads, or do they actually have some tensions with one another? And this idea of archetypes, ways of envisioning the food system, is it's offered as a way to help think about this problem. I may be wrong, I may have my archetypes wrong, so I'm really offering this much in the spirit of what Kate Miller talked about yesterday as a way of facilitating a conversation, as a way of really trying to move a conversation about food ethics forward. So before I get into that, let me just say a little bit about what I mean by archetypes. It's not a particularly familiar word. We can think about an archetype as just a prototype or a pattern of behavior, a way of thinking about something. We could think about it as a scenario or a vision. So these would be visions of how the future of agriculture is going to progress based on what we can do today, what our current technology is, but also particularly from the perspective of people working in food and agricultural science, the kinds of technologies that we're developing, the kinds of technologies that we see as changing the practice of agriculture. And I'm thinking about this in terms of a concept that in philosophy and the social sciences is sometimes called socio-technical imaginaries. So I am mostly going to speak in plain English, but for about the next maybe 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to do my philosophy part. So some of you can take a short nap, and I will tell you when to come back. You know, this notion of socio-technical imaginaries derives from an idea called the social imaginary. And the social imaginary was really introduced into philosophy by a French intellectual, Cornelius Castoriadis, whose book, The Imaginary Institution of Society in the 1970s, was intended to bring to our attention this sense in which much of our reality, much of what we think of as real and as constraining our activity and defining our possibilities depends on things that are not actual physical constraints. Much of it is the sense in which we're constrained by markets or by even a construct such as human nature, what it means to be a human being, what our possibilities are as human beings. These things, these ideas attain a sort of power over us. They become necessities largely because they're so widely believed, and it's only because they're shared by many people that they actually take on the force of reality. We have to interact in markets because that's how other people understand themselves and each other. And so this construct of a market, which doesn't have any biological or underlying natural formulation, becomes a reality and becomes something that we have to cope with. Concepts of identity or nationality or ethnicity or race or gender are constructs that constrain our thinking because everyone thinks this way. And because everyone thinks this way, they attain a certain sort of power and become realities, but their underlying root is essentially in the imagination. For Castoriadis, he wanted to talk about the social imaginary. He wanted to say that there is a kind of set of constructs that really define reality for all of us. And he wanted to really emphasize the sense in which science and the efficacy of science, the ability to practice science and to introduce technologies, was partly enabled by this common sense of a social imaginary. In later work, especially Charles Taylor's book has been very influential. The notion of social imaginaries became plural. So there wasn't one social imaginary that binds everybody, but in fact there are many social imaginaries, and different groups of people seem to operate with different social imaginaries, different ways of envisioning and understanding the realities that affect us. But nonetheless, as in Castoriadis's work, these social imaginaries have a kind of power, and they drive the kind of changes that become possible. They determine the kinds of science that gets done and the kinds of technologies that get developed. So the one person that's really emphasized the technological piece of this, and a personal friend of mine, is Sheila Jasanoff. And Sheila has been the person that's added the technical in this, the socio-technical imaginary. And she does this to stress the way in which once we introduce a material technology, it becomes part of the material world. And it didn't necessarily have to be this way. but it becomes a very powerful force in terms of constraining what is possible to do and what in fact will get done in the future. So you can think about my archetypes as contrasting socio-technical imaginaries, and in terms of the way that I'm going to talk about them, I'm going to emphasize both the sense in which they assume certain social institutions, the way in which they assume certain value commitments or ethical commitments, shared views, but also the sense in which they involve different contrasting technologies, different technical capabilities. In my first pass through these 4 archetypes, I'm actually going to be emphasizing this technological infrastructure. So here are my 4 archetypes that I want to talk about. So those of you who are not here for the philosophy, you can wake up now and start paying attention again. We'll start with technological modernization. And technological modernization is essentially what we have been doing for some time, and it will continue to be very influential in the future. The idea in technological modernization is that we produce food primarily in rural areas. The way in which we produce it is driven by technological innovations. But these innovations come about and they become introduced because they economize on scarce factors. The factors that are scarce are different in different parts of the world. In the United States, it's been labor that's been scarce. In Japan, it was land that was scarce. And so we've actually seen very different trajectories of technology in Japan and the United States. And some of the influential work on technological innovation in agriculture was done by Hayami and Rutan, comparing the United States and Japan specifically on these scarce factors. Of course, in some respects, we can go back throughout the history of agriculture for hundreds of years and see innovations that have changed the shape and trajectory of agriculture. And we could start with crop rotations, which are 400 or 500 years old or maybe older, to some of the improved hand tools. But what I really want to emphasize by this notion of technological modernization is a process that really gets started in the 19th century. If I speak on this from a U.S. perspective, I would point to President Abraham Lincoln, who created the U.S. Department of Agriculture and created our research system with the idea that making 2 blades of grass grow where one had grown before would be something that would be helping the vast majority of the American people. And he saw this as a joint project between private firms that would be innovating these technologies and government or educational institutions that would be doing this work. So if we look at where technological modernization has brought us, we see these very large production systems with organisms that are very uniform in their shape. If we look at fields, we see lots of plants that are exactly the same height and that are blooming or blossoming at exactly the same time. If we look at animal production systems, we see lots of genetically very similar, identical animals that can be processed in hand mechanically. This, in some respects, the pictures tell the whole story of where technological modernization has brought us. Now on the plus side, agricultural scientists and agricultural business people are fond of pointing out that we do actually produce plenty of food with this system, and the farmers that have been able to stay in farming are no longer poor. American farmers are now thoroughly middle class, and some of them are quite wealthy. And on top of that, at least Americans spend a smaller percentage of their income on food than anyone else in the world. So if the United States is the place where this archetype has gone furthest, then these would be the ethical points in its favor. But as I think everyone at this conference recognizes, this system has a number of problems, and I can't talk about all of them, but let me just highlight a few. If we were to look at the kinds of innovation that we've seen since 1850, we started out with mechanization and motorization. That would be machinery and powered machinery that would be replacing draft animals and that would be replacing a lot of hand labor. The next phase was the introduction of chemical technologies, especially fertilizers, in connection with the ability to synthesize nitrogen. And then finally, information and genetic technologies that created the kind of uniform plants and animals that I was showing in my picture. And the problems, one is that this led to enormous changes in diet and consumption. And then secondly, it led to two kinds of technology treadmill. For the changes in diet and consumption, this is actually something that I don't know that we had many papers at this conference. But you know, we have seen this system focus on high production of certain kinds of plants and animals, and consumers are just expected to eat whatever comes out of the end of that industrial pipeline, and that is not necessarily particularly healthy foods. So certainly in the United States, we're starting to see a significant, I think one of the real evident bits of food ethics is in the public health domain, where we're seeing a significant upturn in dietary-based diseases, diabetes and heart disease. And, but the industry basically looks at this as, well, if we can sell it, it must be okay. Focusing on the technology treadmills, very briefly, we have a kind of agronomic treadmill. As I mentioned, we start out with this motorization technologies, and then that gives rise to the chemical technologies, the fertilizers. The crops grow taller and taller, but of course, if you're going to be out there with a tractor, you want all of them to be flowering and being ready to be harvested at the same time. And that creates a feast for the insect pests, and so then you need more chemical technologies to address that sort of problem. And so we've been in this technology treadmill where the last technology creates the next generation of problems, and we need more science and we need more technology to solve the problems that we've created. And in many respects, I would say much of what we're seeing with biotechnologies fit very well in this technology treadmill pattern. I've already mentioned about the issue of losing farmers. And there's an economic treadmill that partly explains this. I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but as you introduce a new farm technology that's more efficient, the producers that are kind of the leading producers are the first to adopt it. And for a while, they make lots of money. But the people that are slow to adopt it are actually trying to sell their crops it's actually cost them too much to produce their crops. The price is starting to fall, and so they find themselves under economic pressure. Many of them lose their farms and have to exit farming. And in the meantime, the farmers who bought the technology very early buy those farms. And so that's really what's fueled this process of fewer farmers and larger farms in the U.S. With the early adopters buying the farms of the producers who've gone out of business. So these two treadmills have really fueled a very significant set of problems in the kind of agriculture that has been created by technological modernization. And in many respects, the other three archetypes that I'm going to talk about are partial responses to this big set of problems that we see with technological modernization. So first, let me talk about what I'm calling sustainable intensification. Since one of the themes of this conference has been climate, let me emphasize some of the climate-related elements of the sustainable intensification archetype. This is a map that indicates some of the projected impacts of climate change on agricultural yields. That is, you know, basically you can look at this as where it's green, farms are going to do better because it's getting better, it's getting warmer, or the climatic conditions are improving. But wherever it's red, it's going to be more dry, it's going to be too hot, in some cases it's going to be flooded. and we're actually going to see very significant declines in agricultural production in the red and orange and to some extent in the yellow areas. In addition to this, agriculture has become a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. This is partly because of the use of fertilizers, and we did have some discussion of that. But it's also because as we've moved to more and more animal consumption, we've increased agriculture's footprint, and the animals themselves are a major source of greenhouse gas. So essentially, sustainable intensification is an archetype that focuses on increasing the efficiency of production on the existing land base, especially the land base that will be in production after a significant amount of climate change, in order to conserve wild areas, in order to preserve biodiversity, and also to serve as carbon sinks that would offset some of the effects of greenhouse gas. It is a vision of agriculture that tries to address pollution, including carbon emissions, and also the conservation of water and soil through new technological innovations that are more efficient in terms of the way that they utilize water especially, but also soil resources. So this is an archetype that is advocated by mainstream agricultural scientists, to some extent by many industry groups, and also by many conservation groups. They see this as important because they see this as a way to preserve lands that are being threatened by invasion from agriculture. This would be a picture of some sustainable intensification technologies using greenhouses, particularly these plastic high tunnel, low tunnel production systems to increase your agricultural production and using more efficient irrigation technologies, and then also, of course, developing plant varieties that are resistant to drought or climatic variations. So again, sustainable intensification is agricultural science's answer to the environmental problems of technological modernization. If I go down here and talk about this archetype, I've called it in my first pass extensification, and that's actually a little mischievous. It's not a very meaningful word, but I use that word to suggest that it is in some respects in opposition to or seen as the opposite of sustainable intensification. I think probably a better term, and this is what I'll continue to use, is this idea of a regional food system. This is what my colleagues at Michigan State who work in this field prefer to call it. So the idea here is that we would actually be returning, we would be in some respects going backwards a bit, returning to diverse farms and to market gardens, but really focusing on being close to urban areas, but not within urban areas, for producing healthier foods, vegetables, meat, milk, and eggs. It's a system that would see the food being distributed through new social institutions, farmers markets, food hubs, community-supported agriculture, farm-to-chef measures, farm-to-school structures. Lots of institutional food systems are starting to make these direct links to small-scale producers. And this is the picture that sort of conveys what we're thinking about with respect to a regional food system archetype. So I think maybe I don't need to say a lot more about this, but we would be thinking about these systems as being regionally structured. In other words, producers would be trying to cut down the distance in which food is being shipped, trying to cut down on some of the ecological impacts that way, and essentially trying to get more money into the farmer's pocketbook through marketing institutions that don't have quite so many middle pieces, you know, food processors and grocery chains and so on and so forth, right? Now this is an archetype that I think in the US in particular, but in some respects in other countries as well, is emerging in response to the economic treadmill. It's really been intended to provide a way for small farmers to be able to survive in an economic environment where these larger scale production systems are becoming dominant and where they just can't really remain profitable. They really can't compete with these larger scale commodity production systems. So finally, I'm going to come to my last archetype, which I'm calling urban agriculture. Here I would start out by showing you this map, which is a map, it's a little bit out of date, but it's indicating the emergence of megacities globally. So the red dots are, I've forgotten what the figure is, but I can't quite read it, in excess of 10 million, and the orange dots are 5 to 10 million people, and then the yellow dots are 2 to 4 million people. So you get a sense of where these megacities are emerging, and there are a lot of people there that have to be fed. And then what you can do is if we take that map and then go back to the climate map and then superimpose them upon one another, we can actually see that there are some parts of the world where the emergence of these megacities is actually overlapping with some of these areas that are going to be most dramatically affected by climate change. So urban planners in these parts of the world, planners who are responsible for these megacity populations, are really starting to question whether the existing agricultural system is going to be adequate to secure the food needs of people in their cities. And so they're starting to actually, you know, they've never incorporated food systems into their planning before. They focus on transportation and economic development and you know, zoning and so on. But now they're actually starting to think about food as a component of urban planning. And so there actually are there is an archetype of food production that's starting to emerge from this kind of thinking. And it actually starts to look at a significant amount, perhaps not a total amount of food for the city's needs, but a significant amount being controlled under city governance structure and actually happening within metro areas. Now this would include both horizontal urban agriculture, that is using spaces such as rooftops or land that is still remaining in these cities, but it also includes vertical agriculture that would be producing food inside of urban structures. And so we actually get what is in some respects technologically the least coherent of my four archetypes, but it incorporates both this you know, very familiar looking garden in unclaimed land in an urban area, but it also includes this very modern high-tech production. This is being envisioned not only for plant production, but also for animal production. If you have not done so, I would encourage you to Google impossible meat, which is an alternative to meat production that uses a genetically engineered organism combined with some plant protein to produce meat products or meat-like. There's a debate. The meat industry thinks this isn't meat. They call it fake meat. But whether it's fake or real, you know, I'll leave that to someone else. But this is part of the vision of what might make urban systems more secure. So this is a vision that is really driven by a concern that particularly in the future, as not only it's not, you know, human population tends to grow, but more significantly, it grows primarily in urban areas. And we have these challenges that are going to be associated with climate change. We need to start envisioning a food system that is under the control of an urban area, right? Now, in some parts of the U.S., this has a very strong racial justice aspect, because many of the people who have been most affected by food insecurity have been African American populations and other minority populations that live in urban cores that are not well served by the industrial food system. The picture at the top from Detroit, just 100 miles from where I live, was taken at a time when the entire city of Detroit did not have a grocery store in its city limits. and people had to rely on either fast food or very small little shops that only sold canned foods and processed foods for their food. So this was a project that was undertaken under the leadership of the Detroit Black Neighborhood Coalition in order to start getting some food access. So there's a very strong social justice, food access piece to this. But the other piece of it is that some of the more vertical agriculture piece is tied to economic development, and the urban planners see enticing the companies and the technological innovators that would produce food in a more industrial environment as a way to enhance their vertical agriculture piece. So this archetype has a lot of internal tension. It's, is it really going to be appropriate to include these kinds of high-tech farming systems? Are people going to accept them? Are they going to call that real food, or are they going to call that fake food? When your focus is solely on investing for economic development, it might not really congeal well with the emphasis on food security and social justice. All of these systems have very significant power relationships, whether it's control over the land, but if that land is at the top of a building, it's still going to be a very capital-intensive system. And at least in the U.S., these have been very sensitive to certain racial and ethnic tensions, which I will not talk about, but if people have questions, I can talk about them. So I want to kind of wrap up now by kind of revisiting these archetypes and talking about them in terms of the way in which sustainability seems to be conceptualized or thought about with respect to my four archetypes. So if I start with the top two archetypes, the technological modernization, which will continue. Agribusiness is not going away anytime soon. The sustainability is largely defined in both of these archetypes through increasing efficiencies. In technological modernization, it's primarily the efficiencies that are defined by the existing market structures. So you're being more efficient if you can make more money, is essentially the definition there. Whereas over in sustainable intensification, efficiencies are really much more focused on yield per acre and by unit of pollution. So we're trying to get more per acre and more for less pollution. If we shift over here to the bottom half, these two archetypes really primarily understand sustainability in terms of food sovereignty and control over the food system. So they're not so much emphasizing technological efficiency as they're emphasizing the social institutions and who is effectively controlling the food system. In the regional food systems model, the control would rest largely in the hands of household producers, traditional family farms, if you like, but it would be essentially trying to empower those small producers, whereas in the urban agriculture, the emphasis is on control by the urban food consumers. If we look over here and split it this way, we would see that in technological modernization and regional food system, sustainability's primary focus is on food producers. In the case of technological modernization, those are increasingly large producers that control a lot of capital and control a lot of land, whereas in the regional food system, they would be very small producers, but nonetheless, the focus is on the food producer in terms of making the food system more sustainable. Whereas when we come over here and look at the other side of the system, sustainability is really defined not so much in terms of a focus on any particular individuals, but as an aggregate property of the system, right? Is the system overall producing enough food? Is it producing it in a way that reduces environmental impact, that conserves on natural resources, or that preserves access to consumers? And so we really wind up with a very different kind of focus on the way that we're understanding the people part of sustainability. So I'm going to wrap up now just by saying that all four of these archetypes are active and they're emergent. You know, I don't think of these as we'll have one, right? I think that they're competing with one another. I think there are different actors that are envisioning the food system in each of these ways and that are trying to innovate technologies and innovate social institutions in ways that will make these archetypes realities, that will give them the kind of shared vision that makes them influential in the future. If we think about Bruno Latour's notion of technological innovations, the various technologies that I've sketched are actants. They're actually part of these networks that combine with people who have particular visions. And so you actually see campaigning for various kinds of animal production systems or various kinds of crop production systems, the actual technologies as enabling and empowering certain kinds of actors and working against the interests of other kinds of actors. So there is perhaps some opportunity for convergence or for consilience among these systems, or possibly it will just be that one of them becomes dominant. Perhaps some of them will become dominant in one part of the world and others will be dominant in another part of the world. My closing thought for you, particularly those of you who are working in agricultural universities or agricultural institutions, is that agricultural research and technology development may well be the place where some of these tensions between the four archetypes become most severe. So that's my talk. Thank you.
With his philosophical inquiry, Poul analyzed clearly, crystal clear indeed, the pros and cons of the four food systems. May I encourage all our participants from Asia and the Pacific regions by standing on the shoulder of Professor Thompson. We may make some explore or study of the archetype of our own food systems. So still have some time. May I open the floor. Anybody have questions, please raise your hand and speak quickly.
Thank you, Professor Thompson, for your presentation. My name is John, and I'm a promoter and planner for urban agriculture, and I participate the urban agriculture, urban farming projects in Taipei and Taichung City. Of course, I believe in the value of urban agriculture, but we often challenge, say that although you grow a lot of fruit and vegetables in the city, but these fruit and vegetables don't really provide calories needed for the city. Yeah, and I wasn't able to,
You know, so I think that, certainly where urban agriculture, urban production is today, it would be ridiculous to think that you could actually meet a significant portion of a city's food needs with urban production. But I would encourage you to take a look at some of these technologies that are under development, because a lot of the innovators that are, particularly the vertical systems, they actually envision, and I have no idea, I am not the person to tell you, what's the environmental impact of these systems? Are they good? Are they bad? I don't know. But there are certainly scientists and technological innovators who think they have the answer to your question. And this extends well beyond just fruit and vegetable production, that there would be a significant amount of basic protein production, if not within the city, at least under the city's direct control. But having said that, and I think that that is the first point to note, there are ways in which I think you could see a kind of alliance between what I've called technological modernization and a kind of urban agriculture. And that would be, you turn over all of the fresh fruits and vegetables to an urban production system, and then you just produce your commodity crops in a more traditional kind of technological modernization kind of way. And so I think that's another way in which this might actually pan out.
Okay. Another questions, please.
Thank you, thank you, Professor Poul. I'm very interested in your presentation and your study. And today, in your today's presentation, you mentioned about the vision of the food security in urban that include the high-tech of food production, such as a plant factory or the high-tech meat. I remember that you also talked about this in your book, From Field to Fork. However, you seems don't take sides on this issue. So may you share us your position on this kind of food manufacture industry?
Okay, so on the one hand, part of my not taking sides, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm totally neutral here, I'm always a little, I use the word mischievous, right? I actually think that by pulling out some of these tensions, we might actually be able to have the kind of conversation that moves our food visions into something that's a little more coherent, something that's a little happier in terms of some of these tensions, right? So part of my reluctance to take sides is precisely because I think it might be premature to do that. That by taking sides, I would really be, kind of preventing the emergence of the more sophisticated conversation that I hope would emerge. Right? I have to say I'm not really enthusiastic about synthetic meats. It just doesn't, it bothers me in some sort of way. I taught a course this semester at Michigan State on ethics in animals, and my students all loved this stuff. Some of them had tried these synthetic meats that you don't have to slaughter the animal to get the meat. And so I can appreciate that if you have a very strong, if where you entered into food ethics is that you're concerned about the impact on animals, these technologies just may look really like a wonderful solution to you. But they trouble me both because they seem to be so technologically intense. They seem to be yet another turn of what I was calling the technological treadmill. Maybe I'm just old-fashioned and romantic at heart. I don't know. But I am a little, so that's kind of my honest reaction. But I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want to be, I'm not ready to stand up and be an advocate against some of these kinds of technologies because they're quite young and it's hard to see where they're actually going to go. Maybe they could be, maybe their trajectory could be shaped in ways that would make them look much more attractive to me.
Okay, time is up. We have only 2 minutes. So please, very quickly.
It's okay. No, my colleague. I can. Thank you very much.
Very quickly.
Yeah, sorry. So, I'm through workshop with various people, bureaucracy, NGO staff, and so on, farmer. Emotionally, sometimes bind us over material. How do you think we can detachment for good discussion? May I ask?
So how can we come up with better judgments and discussions? So in some respects, I mean, one of the things that I really appreciated about Dr. Miller's talk yesterday was the emphasis on how you would structure a discussion and some of the things that you did in your own presentation where you were talking about the use of serious games. Games, I mean, you know, as was indicated, I mean, I recognize that, you know, as a philosopher, I can't go out, you know, my audience is limited, right? When I wrote my book, actually it was the publisher who wanted to call it Food Ethics for Everyone. I was thinking, well, I've written this book, you know, that if someone told you you had to read it, you'd be able to read it. That was my ambition, right? You know, but you know, it's the kind of book that gets assigned in a class. It's not a book that is going to, you know, be a bestseller. And I don't think philosophy is ever going to do that. But some of these game-type activities and some of the arts and some of the literary activities, I think, are more effective ways to engage the public. But I would also say that, you know, it's a mistake to do that in the absence of philosophy. That philosophy is, in some respects, the discourse that needs to stand behind all of that, and that is a way of bringing some of those kinds of activities into a more explicit and more reflective kind of conversation.
Okay, time is up. Anybody still have questions, please contact Poul during coffee break or by other opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.